Thank you very much, Bryony, and also thank you to Mark for inviting me today. A sort of walking miracle, my skin bright as a Nazi lampshade, my right foot a paperweight, my face a featureless fine Jew linen. Peel off the napkin, oh my enemy, do I terrify. So declares the female narrator of Sylvia Plath's poem Lady Lazarus, who, identifying herself with Jewish suffering in what we might take as a gesture of profound imaginative trespass or one of profound ethical attentiveness, ascends from the grave to rail against the repressive machinery of the fascist state. Hair Lucifer, beware, beware, out of the ash I rise with my red hair and I eat men like air, she proclaims with an excessive and ferocious energy that moves perilously close to the tormentor's own rage-filled rhetoric. So, whilst claiming retrospective allegiance to the Jewish victim, lashing out against the memory of an oppressive past and the assorted rituals of state terror, she also forges at the level of fantasy and via the imaginative trajectory of the voice, a troubling identification with the Nazi perpetrator. A perpetrator whose crimes she rises from death to avenge. The body returned, the subject revivified, Lady Lazarus conjures the spectral figure of the awakened, the wakeful corpse, whose attribution of voice and consciousness enables her uncanny return to the land of the living and to the identificatory lures and dark imaginings of a psyche in troubled times. For performing her own fraught relation to a recent and violent history, the corpse of Lady Lazarus also testifies to the identifications, those terrifying or idealized revenants of the unconscious, phantasmal relics from the past that, in George Eliot's words, quote, moved within her like ghosts. Identification is, as the scholar Diana Fuss reminds us, a ghostly affair. To be open to an identification, she says, is to be open to a death encounter, open to the very possibility of communing with the dead. There are some ghosts that refuse to lie down, that trip and sway across our political identities and destinies, and whether consciously summoned or appearing dreadful and unheralded like the return of the repressed, find their way back to haunt, stalk, and unsettle the precarious mental topographies of political and cultural life. Such anxious fantasies of resurrection and imaginative recovery, of the dead returning to cajole the living and disrupt the past, restlessly beat their rhythms across our psychic and political landscapes, especially, it seems, in troubled times, when things are going wrong or can't be accounted for, in those highly invested occasions when, to quote the artist Gerhard Richter, the world is reflected back at us as, quote, wretched, cynical, stupid, helpless, confusing. We have lost the great ideas. We have lost all faith, everything that creates meaning. Hopeless to the utmost degree, we roar across a toxic waste dump in extreme peril. Every one of those incomprehensible shards, odds and ends of junk and detritus, menaces us, constantly hurts and maims us. So the artist announced in early 1988, shortly before embarking on a series of paintings which, via their belated encounter with the spectral remains, the incomprehensible shards, of a traumatizing political history and its inadmissible affects, perform something akin to a resurrection. In October 1977, his cycle of 15 differently scaled paintings that take as their subject the notorious events of the so-called German Autumn, we are witness to a reawakening. Ulrike Meinhof, Gudrun Ensslin, Andreas Bader, and Holger Mainz, the principal members of the radical left-wing group, the Red Army faction, stage a return. They rise, emerging like the restlessly roving corpse of Lady Lazarus out of amnesiac silence and their own deathly repose to enter an anxiously liminal realm of exchange and intention. Based on press forensic press and forensic photographs of the West German militants' arrest, incarceration, presumed suicides inside Stammheim prison, and their fiercely contested burial, the group's re-arrival on the scene is, however, far from smooth. This is not an optimistic or redemptive dream of reanimation or recovered utterance. It does not adhere to the compensatory mechanisms of idealization, nor the exercising imperatives of a traumatic working through. It does not offer any promise of mythic resolution, or, as some have suggested, heroic renewal. For at times, these ghosts appear as much haunted as haunting. In the photo paintings named Confrontation 1, 2, and 3, for example, which, like all the pictures in the collection, are painted in a, quote, dull grey, mostly very blurred, diffuse, Gudrun Enslin's resurrected body signifies an elusive and unstable entity. Hovering in an unsettling and somewhat paradoxical space of suspended animation and perceptual ambiguity, the strident militant is here revived and reauthorized as a hesitant and somewhat helpless Lazarean figure, as if she has already passed through death and been born from death. She disrupts any blithe or fictive wish for reanimation, for triumphant recovery. Caught by the stuttering pulse of the series freezing and unfreezing, its disjointed forward motion of snapshot images, and their petrified analogue of movement, she is, it seems, both awakened and repressed, made mobile and immobilized. In a disquieting collision of photographic status and cinematic flow that renders unstable the imagined passage from silence to speech, stillness to movement. Neither fully present nor fully absent, Enslin appears weary, introspective, one might even say anxious. Like, as art historian Andrew McNamara pointedly remarks, quote, a tentative ghost startled at being summoned back from the grave, end quote. Her anguished return is not only ambivalent, it is also apparently short-lived. For as if in flight from her own reawakening, Enslin soon retires to a position of deathly stillness and secure remove. We glimpse in the emphatic, almost impenetrable monochromism of hanged. The revolutionary's lifeless body as it was found on the morning of October 18th, still attached to the grate in her cell. If we follow Richter's gesture of framing the paintings as a cycle with, quote, no beginning and no end, end quote, and the repetition inscribed in the circular logic of this arrangement, then Enslin is, however, shortly thereafter returned to life. Via a mode of spectatorship, permitted to skip around, rewind and return, leap forwards and back, she is intermittently and repeatedly revived, regaining each time her tentative bodily mobility and Lazarean bent. Continually gaining life, only to lose it again, Enslin's anxious oscillation between the registers of absence and presence, animation and petrification, appearance and disappearance, life and death, generates, I would suggest, a certain protracted rhythm of anticipation and suspense, or a kind of paradoxical dreading forward, to borrow a phrase novelist Henry Green coined to describe the effective tenor of an anticipatory future tense. Here, too, we are suspended within a pervasively anxious temporality. For toing and froing between different key moments in the RAF saga, including, crucially, to a time prior to the radicalization that will define and destroy the group's protagonists, such mnemonic returns are inevitably shadowed by a modality of anticipation, of looming and palpable dread. We know what future lies ahead. We know how this saga will end. Sigmund Freud ascribes a peculiar temporality to anxiety, which he characterizes as, quote, on the one hand, an expectation of trauma, and on the other, a repetition of it in mitigated form, end quote. Directing itself to the past and the future, anxiety is, for Freud, Janus-faced. It says to the subject, quote, I'm expecting a situation of helplessness to set in. The present situation reminds me of one of the traumatic experiences I've had before. Therefore, I will anticipate the trauma and behave as though it had already come, while there is yet time to turn aside," end quote. This scripting of anxiety, its distinctive historiography, resonates powerfully with the West German narrative of repressive politics, blocked mourning, and violent resistance that October 18, 1977 revisits. For gripped by the looming anticipation of the Nazi past repeating itself, haunted by the failures of the extra-parliamentary left, and witness to the increasing curtailment of civil liberties and militarized violence unleashed by the German state, the RAF were facing to the past and the future. They were entangled in, were responding to, were aggressively defending against a profoundly anxious historicity. Stalked by the murderous memory of Nazi crimes and fearing, indeed already detecting, their horrific repetition in the political present, the group were anxiously mapping the trajectory of an imminent future in the colours of a traumatic past and implementing the necessary defensive measures to ensure against catastrophe. Dread is just memory in the future tense, wrote the psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, and this is aptly played out in 4 other canvases belonging to the October 18, 1977 corpus. Those depicting political essayist and founding member of the RAF, Ulrike Meinhof. Here, once again, time is out of joint. We are brought face to face with the dead sustained in death, and also, by way of the series shuttling between temporal registers, the dead wishfully conjured and sustained as versions of their former living selves. In Youth Portrait, for example, a small, formally composed and singularly legible painting based on a publicity photograph of the journalist prior to the faction's formation, we are encouraged to imagine Meinhof's reanimation as a fictively young ideologue, ardently committed to a programme of, as yet non-violent, revolutionary change. Framed and recollected from the position of an afterwards, the painting's wishful recollection of youthful idealistic promise is shadowed by the anxious anticipation of a traumatic futurity that we know, for the youthfully envisaged Meinhof, still lurks ahead. It is a futurity we see materialized with grim and repetitive insistence in the sequence of paintings entitled Each in Turn, and with the same uncompromising bluntness of expression, Dead. Based upon the infamous photograph published in news magazine Stern, these canvases depict Meinhof lying dead on the floor of her cell, quote, 3 times after they cut her down, end quote. The unstable interplay of losing and refinding, of withdrawal and return, withholding and awakening that we observe elsewhere in the October series is here encoded at a formal level in the artist's signature blur, and also in the canvas's gradually diminishing scale. For as Kaja Silverman has so cogently noted in her recent analysis of the piece, although unhinged from any linear chronology, Dead is normally presented, quote, so as to encourage the viewer to begin with the largest canvas and end with the smallest. When this prompt is followed, she maintains, the paintings function as 3 glimpses of a disappearing image, because Meinhof's head is less distinct in the second painting than it is in the first, and even fainter in the third, end quote. With each painterly reiteration, then, the dead Meinhof is rendered progressively less amenable, less available to the epistemological grasp of the living. Fading out of visibility, growing ever more opaque, she is removed from the relentless and punishing scrutiny of an objectifying retrospective gaze. In fact, as if beleaguered by those endless and frenetic attempts to assign some singular origin to her turn to violent protest, she was a cold-blooded sociopath. She wasn't strong enough. She couldn't see reality clearly. She had an unfulfilled need for love. She was irrational. She was militant due to her inability to find satisfaction in being a mother. She was masochistic. Meinhof's cadaver would appear to beat a steady retreat from the land of the living and the beat, beat, beat of its accusation and blame. At the same time, the repetitive, manifestly excessive staging of the militant's body as a death-inscribed entity, we encounter her prone figure not once, not twice, but 3 times. Also, paradoxically enough, brings her nearer, resurrects her into the appearance of life. By flattening the grainy tonality of the source photograph and darkening its already gloomy background, the specific corporeal markers of Meinhof's violent death are, with each successive painting, subtly softened and evened out, the prominently lurid wound across her neck gradually fading from view. Both giving representational fixture to the dead body and enacting its effacement, Meinhof is preserved here as proximate presence and distant trace. Poised between the established orders of both the living and the dead, hovering in the unheimlich zone of the revenant or ghost, unavailable, incalculable, indeterminate, she instills a lasting and irresolvable unease. In fact, approached in its entirety, October 18, 1977 is a work awash with anxious affect, pitching the viewer into a prolonged encounter with those revenants of the unconscious, those highly cathected internal objects that people are inner landscapes, and, like Lady Lazarus, refuse to lie down. It registers the profound anxiety of keeping a recent and traumatic past in mind. The deaths of the terrorists and the related events, both before and after, stand for a horror that distressed me and has haunted me as unfinished business ever since, despite all my efforts to suppress it, Richter proclaimed in an interview conducted in 1989. With October 18, 1977, he continues, quote, "I wanted to bring the viewer to pity and sorrow, but also to angst." For Freud, angst is associated with the repressed and with the threat of its resurfacing. It arises, he argues, from recollecting a segment, an incomprehensible shard, of psychic material buried deep within the contours of the unconscious mind. Anxiety is also, he suggests, inaugurated by the threat posed to the subject by loss. Loss of a loved one, loss of control, loss of perception, loss of certainty. It is what we feel when confronted with a situation radically out of proportion to our faculties of perception, of thinking and knowing. And yet anxiety also carries with it a certain psychic, political, perhaps even ethical utility. Remaining anxious, or recuperating the affect belatedly after the fact, becomes for Freud a way of ensuring the mind can endure and respond accordingly to the unpleasurable realities of life. Conveying a protective signal which alerts the psyche to past or present menaces, it is, in effect, a form of wakefulness, of critical alert, a way, quote, of staying in relation to history without being consumed by it, end quote. Staying with anxiety can, however, plunge the psyche into disarray, shattering its boundaries and defences, dismantling it from within, and can also, via the ego's unrelenting efforts to ward off the feeling, engender the most primitive and unyielding of psychic political states. For failing to tolerate or attempting to resolve anxiety too quickly or with too much conviction risks letting loose the schizoid derealizations of mania. Risks, in fact, the subject waging her own war of psychic terror on the world. With their increasingly ruthless and intractable message of dissent, their absolutist worldview and extreme emotional binarism, we delight in the death of every cop that gets killed. The guy in uniform is a swine, not a person. Either you are part of the problem or part of the solution. There is nothing in between. The RAF were, Richter says, victims of what he terms ideology. Those rigid modalities of thought and behaviour which, driven by a fierce self-righteousness and militant resolve, banish anxiety by providing a sense of mastery in the face of powerlessness, in the face of potentially self-eroding doubt. The Baader-Meinhof episode would seem to resonate tragically then with the question posed recently by Jacqueline Rose. How can the dispossessed, mired in anxiety, quote, claim their legitimate rights without taking on the psychic trappings of the oppressor? Without, that is, regressing to the manic defenses and retaliatory fantasies that can erupt in response to an acute and maddening anxiety. For many on the left, the RAF's narrowed mindset, rhetorical cruelty, and black and white thinking evidenced a kind of totalitarianist zeal or leftist fascism. It was, as if to quote the writer Klaus Thulett, quote, the spirit of their parents' generation they had tried to escape from had slipped back into them. As if, in the project of announcing and defending against the scenario of fascist oppression, they had, like Lady Lazarus, internalized the oppressor, assuming his quality and character as the only way to ensure his defeat. Such accounts of the group's boundless triumphalism and dogmatic fervour are conspicuously absent from Richter's October series. Instead, we are presented with a Gudrun Ensslin and Ulrike Meinhof, who speak, albeit ambivalently, from a position of grievance, as the tragic victims, not, it seems, of a brutal and authoritarian state apparatus, but rather of what the artist brands, quote, ideological behaviour per se. By encouraging the viewer to empathically invest in the 3 times Ensslin hanged, 3 times the dead Meinhof after they cut her down, and making no reference to their frenetic aggression and militant rage, the series calls attention to the limits and perils of a more discomforting identification, with a Gudrun Ensslin and Ulrike Meinhof resurfaced as violent perpetrator. For such gestures of radical empathy would be decidedly fraught and formidably affective. They'd risk plunging the viewer into a profoundly, perhaps intolerably anxious psychic space. Risk exposing, in fact, those violent and extreme elements that lurk unfurled in the recesses of our own interior landscapes. Inconspicuously absenting the group's violent militancy, the October series anxiously acknowledges that endeavouring to enter the mind of the perpetrator is sometimes deemed one identification too far. I wanted to bring the viewer to angst, Richter proclaims, and it is to angst that we are undoubtedly and unrelentingly brought. In fact, backpedaling across the traumas of Germany's political past to trace and awaken the affective dynamics of a history the artist fears is, quote, being thrown away from us like garbage, October 18, 1977 calls upon the viewer repeatedly, insistently, to stay anxious, to remain exposed to anxiety's affective charge, to stay with, rather than to slay, one's ghosts. Far from counselling a stance of resigned passivity, bleak inertia, or quietist despair, staying anxious here becomes a tentative form of possibility, a mode of wakefulness, a way of remaining attuned to an unmasterable, turbulent history which persists as an enduring influence and a living effect. For Richter, October 18, 1977 represents, quote, the hard-to-bear refusal to answer, to explain, to give an opinion, end quote, manifesting the specular ambiguities, perceptual disruptions, and temporal paradoxes that Freud associates with anxiety. The October series offers, it seems, no refuge of mastery or promise of certitude. Instead, the series opens up and argues for what Jacqueline Rose has compellingly termed an interval of reflection, that highly anxious moment between impulse and action when identification and thoughtfulness can occur, when it becomes possible to imagine a position outside one's own. Suspended, like the precariously reanimated Gudrun Ensslin, on the threshold between stasis and movement, impulse and action, such anxious moments create a space or pause for recursive and critical thinking, a dynamic and facilitating space in which to imagine, take stock, and orient ourselves in new politically enabling ways. Thank you.